before I get going and talk about myself, which I don't really like to do, to be honest, but the GA back in Australia is a highly respected organisation that we see as being considerably successful. Spending the last 3 days here in Dublin, and in particular today, I can actually see why it is successful. I'm actually blown away about the pride and passion that you all in the room have for your clubs and counties. From an amateur organisation, and the majority of you, I'm assuming, are volunteers, there's no doubt that's the reason why this organisation is successful. So I've learnt a lot in a short space of time, but I think the AFL can definitely learn a lot from how you guys and ladies go about your business. So I just wanted to congratulate you, and it's definitely made a lasting impact on me. My role at the AFL, a bit of background, is I was a strength and conditioning coach at a AFL club. At 28 years of age, I got drafted into the AFL, so I was a late bloomer. Ended up fortunately playing 100 games and winning a premiership with the Geelong Cats. Went on to coach for a couple of years at the Adelaide Crows, and at the end of 2017, the Adelaide Crows, we lost the grand final, and I just didn't see coaching as my true passion or my future. So I got a job at the AFL as Stakeholder manager, which is basically working with clubs, coaches, players, and being the link between the governing body effectively. And one of the things that my team led last year was this rule change project. And I know you, the GA at the moment, have a standing committee that are doing something similar. So what I actually wanted to talk about is the journey that we actually went through and some of the learnings that we got out of it. But the main one is basically the title up there that everyone in the room, not just the GA, not just the standing committee, needs to have a care for the health of the game. It's not just up to us in our example or the standing committee to change rules to make sure the game flourishes. The previous speaker, I heard him say at the end of it that you all have a role about developing athletes and the next lot of players, but you also have a role in how you care for the game and where it's going to be in the next 5, 10, 20 years, so you make sure you leave it better. So that was the number one learning that we had that's not up to us. Just to start the presentation on what we sort of did, we had to actually redefine this relationship that we had between the AFL and clubs. And my role being a stakeholder manager was basically getting these clubs, or getting the clubs, making sure that they feel part of the journey and being really collaborative and consultative around this. So that was sort of the first step that we went through when it came to this journey. We had to actually create some enablers if we're going to change anything, and people fear the word change and people fear the word rules. So it was a pretty challenging project to be on. But what we did was we implemented a competition committee, which was 12 people from Clubland, along with some executives from the AFL. There was players, coaches, general managers of football, CEOs and presidents that we developed in this competition committee. And that wasn't just for rules of the game. It was also our talent pathways, our second tier competition, how that all looks, how we're actually going to go into the next broadcasting deal. These guys here will help that and be a bit of a filter for the AFL. And then for the first time in the AFL's history, we actually set up a game analysis team. So we brought in basically 5 people from Clubland, an opposition analysis, a coach, a past player, an administrator, to actually look at the game from a club lens and work out what strategies were in the game and where it was going to. Looked at statistics, so something the AFL hadn't done in the past. So we basically had 2 teams that were set up that were there to actually help this process go forward. Defining the problem, the opportunity came up pretty early in the year. But scoring in the AFL in the last 12 months was the lowest it's been for 50 years. So that's a graphic from 2010. You can sort of see a steady decline in that. So is it a problem? Is it an opportunity? Everyone's got a different opinion on that, which is fine. The other thing we see in our game is a whole heap of numbers around the ball, and I'll get to why that is potentially a bit of an issue for the future of broadcasting. But a whole heap of numbers is another thing that we see in our game. And the other thing that is an opportunity for us, but also where we're headed as a society, is there's more people watching sport on these devices than there are on television, even people that are going to games anymore. So that's another opportunity for us. So this context is really important for when it comes to actually landing something at the end of the project. Before we start thinking about everyone's personality and most people's personality is, if there's a problem, let's think of a solution really quickly. And most of the people in our team are like that too, but we have to actually stop and take a breath with this. And if we're going to make any objective decisions, we need to analyse as many things as we possibly can. And that's what we went away and did. And I'll just show you a snapshot of some of those things as we go along through this presentation. The first thing we did, though, was we need to understand the context, and the context in particular of coaching and how coaching has evolved over centuries, to be frank. But our game at the moment this is an example of our coach's box. There's about 13 people in that coach's box. And on the left, there's a stats box with another probably 10 people in it, all analysing statistics, player positioning, the way the ball's moving, the way the team's defending. So basically now we've almost got one official to one player on the ground. That's a photo from about 1946. It's a coach called Checker Hughes who coached Melbourne back in the VFL days. There was one coach back then. So over the last 60 years, and in particular the last probably 10 to 15 years, the resources that we've got available to us now and the tools that players have got has just grown. And it's grown for the better. Let's not, but we just need to understand that concept when we talk about analysing our game and what to do with it. There's a whole heap of different influences in sports coaching over centuries. One of them you can argue that is a guy called Frederick Taylor. So he developed the scientific management system, which is basically like one best way for doing things. And what that was designed to do, most modern manufacturing firms would have some systems of these basically going on every day. It was basically creating a system where there was minimal waste. So previous to this theory, the way you actually taught someone a trade, whether it was woodworking, furniture making, building a house, is if I was a builder, I would teach my apprentice the way I got taught, and basically you just get passed down from generation to generation over the century. This guy came up with basically a system, which is great because it's efficiency when it comes to money and making business more profitable. A system is much better. But one thing it does do is it stifles creativity and problem solving for the individual. So we just need to think about that. It's been an influence on coaching. We've had technology has been a massive influence on coaching, and we just can't think, we always think really narrow when we talk about technology, the last 10 or 20 years. Technology in sport has been going on for 150 years effectively, but this is one of the first cameras, I think it was in the late 19th century, where they actually wanted to work out whether 4 of the horse's hoofs were off the ground at one time. So talk about, is there any biomechanical people in here? This is almost like the first biomechanical study that was done about this. So, technology has been in sport for a very, very long time. The other influence is the influence of the military. And we always talk about our players going into battle and on the playing pitch. The influence of the military drill has been there for a long time. And you talk about, let's do a football drill, let's do a goal kicking drill, let's do a passing drill. It's all about drills. So we've got to understand that some of the historical influences of sports coaching have come from the military. You can sort of see these guys with tennis rackets in their hands marching along. There's a couple of good graphics here. There's the era of the drill and the era of being stronger and fitter than your opponent, whether it was at the military or in sport. And that has really grown over the last probably 20 years with sports science coming through. But the photo on the far left there has got 25 old ladies or girls with a tennis racket trying to learn how to play tennis. Now, in that graphic, there's no ball and there's no opposition and there's no court. But these guys are learning how to play tennis through drill modelling. So you could almost argue that the whole football drill concept came from this. We also looked at, there's a presentation we did for our competition committee, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail because it means nothing to you, but basically looked at all the different strategies that have been existed over our game from the late 60s to 70s to the current day and the current present. And as we found out, the strategies in our game has continued to grow, and it's grown through technology and the ability to analyse the game. So another thing that we looked at was scoring is the top blue line here in 2000. And the bottom line here, I'm sure you've got a similar stat in both your games here, is your ability to move the ball from one end of the ground, from your defensive 50 in our sense, to your forward 50. So in 2007, 41% of balls or ball movement ended up in the forward 50. In 2018, in the first 18 rounds, only 22% ended up in the forward 50. So that's halved. And what we sort of looked at and what we found out that was in 2008, the AFL introduced behind the goal vision, where coaches can actually access that post-game and now see 18 players on the field at one time. And the ability that gave coaches to actually coach players and teach them a system rather than only seeing 6 to 5 or 5 to 6 players on a screen, exponentially gave coaches the ability to teach a system-style defence effectively. So that's what we've sort of seen. And we see this drop-off of ball movement over the last 10 years has potentially happened through the ability of technology and allowing that to, and scoring has obviously done the same thing. So understanding that, we just can't go back in time and take cameras away from coaches. We're never going to do that. We've just got to understand that that's what's happened in the past. Just some other data that we've sort of come across and some insights. This is a graphic on how efficient you are with your ball movement. So currently in the AFL, most teams have about 120 odd chains of possession. So if I handball it to someone, they handball it, that starts a chain of possession. I'm sure you've got a similar stat. Currently, Melbourne was the best in 2018. They averaged 0.8 points per chain. Now, if you go back 6 years, there was 7 less change, approximately, and Hawthorn were averaging 1 point per chain. So that's just an efficiency stat. You can sort of see the trend analysis here is that efficiency in ball movement is decreasing. And if you go back, we went back another 15 years. Basically, if you go back, all those teams are actually green 15 years ago. So defence is now winning, effectively. We also looked at some GPS data as well. So I sort of showed you that graphic earlier about a lot of players being in one area of the ground. Same thing here, this graphic. We actually wanted to put some data around this. So one thing we do have is GPS in our game. So what we did was, this is just a visual of our game and a snapshot of it. I'll just show this for 10 seconds. But basically the ball comes inside. You can sort of see all the players spread, condense. And what we did was basically put a graphic around that where using GPS, the purple line at the top is the furthest most players towards the Geelong goal, and the black line is the furthest most players to the Carlton goal. That's the emblem at the bottom there. And you can sort of see in the first sort of 10 minutes of that quarter, most of the play is in the Carlton end of the ground. And it's really challenging for the ball to be moved out of there. You can almost argue that the red line in the middle is like what the ball is. So in this example here, I think the ball passes the midline 10 times, and there was 1 goal kicked in 20 minutes in this particular game. Now, there was another game which was played in a different environment, an indoor stadium. It wasn't as dewy, different strategy, different tactics, where you can sort of see the air in this bubble or in this graph is a lot greater, which means the players are more spread in the game. Now, that game, the ball crossed the midline 28 times and there was 9 goals kicked. So we're trying to actually define some of the things that we're seeing in our game into data. And I'll talk about our fans in a second as well, but we're not saying that's a really bad game, we're not saying that this is a really good game, it's just understanding the context of what's going on is what we're aiming to do here. Now, the other thing we did was actually ask our fans what they loved about our game, and sport is a really emotional beast, to be honest, so we actually wanted them to elicit that emotion, so we asked them what they love about it, and there was 5 clear things that came up. They love players having freedom, they love players and coaches taking risks, there was a lot about toil and determination and bravery and sacrifice, so the contest was really important to them. And then they love the magical and supernatural, the highlights that you see. In our game, it's the goals from the boundary line or the high marks, which I'm sure you guys have a lot of as well. So you can sort of see that this graphic shows that fans want a bit of everything. So if I go back to one graphic and say that we want this type of game here on the right-hand side where it's really free-flowing and open and no contest, some of our fans don't like that. If you go on the far left where it's a lot of contest, a lot of numbers around the ball, some of our fans want freedom. So it's really a balance between all 5 of those things. And when it comes to changing rules or changing interpretations, we need to factor these things in. And we did. We also liked them the things they didn't like. So congestion is just another word for a whole heap of numbers around the football. Defensive tactics and a defensive approach, which coaches definitely talk about a lot in our press conferences, and it's amazing how our fans are so in tune with our coaches and what they listen to. And I'm sure you guys are all the same here. Player behaviour, so the aggressive behaviour you see during a game, they didn't like that. The atmosphere in the ground was one thing that got brought up. They felt that the game now has got lulls in it, where they've got time to go and get a drink or go to the bathroom, which is really interesting. And then the media coverage, the way our media cover our players and our coaches, they feel is a bit negative. So that were the 5 things that they actually come up with. When we asked them to fill out basically a matrix of those are the 5 things that they love about that game, which of those are vulnerable, which of those enduring, which are increasing. So we've gathered a whole heap of data from our fans, making sure that when it comes to any change, we're actually trying to make them as happy as they possibly can be, because they are the lifeblood of our game at the end of the day. So that's a bit about the context and a bit of the work that we did. Now, in any of these projects, and I'm sure your team here is doing the same thing, you need objectives. So it's all well and good to go, we're going to change rules, but potentially the rule changes aren't the thing that you need to do. So we had to set up some objectives in this actual project, and we actually got them a couple of months into the project, to be frank. It wasn't at the start of the project we go, these are the objectives. As we started to consult and manage our stakeholders, we actually worked this out. So the first one was we actually wanted to highlight the instinctive nature of players. So how do we actually give players a bit more time and space so we can actually see those highlights and let them play the game with some freedom and with some flair and with some risk-taking? We feel that's been a bit of a decline. So anything that we do in the future, we've got to make sure that we see instinctive players playing our game. The second piece is that we can't forget about our coaches. I mean, we can try and make rules that take coaches out of the equation, but the last thing we want to do is create this homogenous game that exists. We want coaches to be able to strategize and have 18 different strategies. In your case, 32 different strategies would be phenomenal. So we can't forget about our coaches when it comes to making change. And the last thing is advancing it for our fans. So as I mentioned earlier, more and more people are watching the game on their phones. So if you've got a game where you can't see a ball on a screen for a period of time, there's 50 other apps on that device that have all got hooked canvases that are going to invite you back in. So if your game isn't actually, if our game isn't exciting enough for players or fans to actually stay switched on that device, we'll lose fans as we go along. So we've got to make sure that if any change that we make, it's advancing it for our fans, and we feel like we've sort of listened to them across the period. The next piece is actually developing a process on how we actually get through to changing rules. And everyone has got an ego, and the last thing we wanted to do is go coming in, and our team, there was 6 of us, we were the guys who were going to change rules. It wasn't about us, it was actually about caring for the game. So the best way we could do that is actually develop a process, and it wasn't about you and your opinion of the game. So basically, we developed like a decision-making funnel, and I'll just quickly go through it. So at the start of this project, based on the objectives, there was about 45 ideas that were basically fed into us from the industry, from coaches, from the competition committee, from ourselves, that they believe, that we believe could actually help the game in those 3 objectives. And what happens is, every of those 45 ideas was basically put into a matrix, and it was our game analysis team that did this initially. And idea on the left, we've got a charter that the game exists. I'm sure you've got something that's similar, which talks about we've got to make sure the game's safe for players, it's free-flowing, we want to see a whole heap of diversity in our game, talls and smalls, etc. So did the idea line up with that? The AFL purpose is to progress the game, but respect its heritage. And that's really, really important. So did the idea, as an example, there's an idea around 16 v 16 rather than 18 v 18 on the field. Now, it's progressive, yes, so I got a green light, but it wasn't respecting the heritage. So basically, it got spat out of the funnel pretty early. And then we looked at all the positives of the idea and all the unintended consequences that we could foresee at that time. So if I go back to the funnel, that was done in that assessment gate period. As I said earlier, some of those ideas just got spat out of the funnel. Then we got into the testing gate, where we started to test the ideas with coaches in training sessions, and eventually in some second-tier competitions as well. And same thing, as we progressed, the unintended consequences list grew for some of the ideas, and those ideas got spat out of the funnel. And basically, we went all the way through to developing the ideas further, and the final approval came from the AFL Commission, which is basically our board. So as much as we did all the work, and the competition committee were a fantastic filter, as I said earlier, the final decision was the AFL Commission. So you can sort of see that it wasn't about us, it was about the industry collaborating on this journey. The other decision-making framework that we used, we found really, really helpful, was this Cynefin framework. And Cynefin's a Welsh word, which I think means habitat, by the way, as a random fact. But this framework basically sort of sees, when it comes to simple decisions on the bottom right-hand corner, a decision like it's cold outside, I'm going to put a jacket on, is a simple decision. And most of those decisions can be automated. So your thermostat, for an example, can actually work out it's cold in a room and lifts the air temperature. So that's a simple decision, can be automated. Now, complicated decisions, an example of that is like, my car is broken, I can't fix it, I need to take it to an expert, a mechanic, to get it fixed. So those decisions are complicated. And we probably believe that in the past, some sporting governing bodies have probably lived in that area when it comes to making decisions on rules. They just get experts in to come in and go, well, the game, do this to the game and it'll fix itself. But where we tried to work was in this, this complex decision-making thing where our game and your games are really complex. Things emerge, different strategies emerge, different rules emerge, different players emerge, strengths, skills, different tools. So in that sort of decision-making quadrant, you need to probe the game, you need to sense it and then respond. So it's about basically trialling things in an emergent way. So not fearing failure. And that's what we tried to do when it came to trialling things in games, trialling things in the second tier, in training sessions. And I know that your standing committee is doing the same thing in the pre-season competition at the moment. The last quadrant, just as a fact, is that chaotic decision-making where, as an example, the Twin Towers go down in New York in September 11, 2001, and Rudy Giuliani just basically acts, senses and responds. There's no simple decision-making there. It's just basically all on instinct, really. So we definitely use this framework over the course of the last 9 months. I mentioned earlier, there was no bad ideas. We just wanted to fail fast. So a lot of startups in Silicon Valley at the moment basically just launch products and they fail fast. And that's what we just tried to do with our things. So we put ideas up, we tried them in a training session. If they failed, we moved on. And it was actually okay. It wasn't actually failure, to be honest. Probing the complex game, I mentioned earlier, you can sort of see we tried an extended goal square here, so that allowed players to actually move the ball forward off the back or behind. Now, this rule didn't get introduced, but we trialled it and had a look at it and see what it did to the game. And the heritage piece for us was the reason why this rule didn't get up in the end, because it was changing lines on the ground. The stakeholder engagement piece, now this is my role back in Australia, back at the AFL, but we basically met with all 18 clubs, all 18 senior coaches, all 18 general managers of football and got their feel on where the game is at and where it's headed. And we probed the game with them. And I can't tell you how important this process was, this whole collaborative approach to what we did. I mean, the last thing I'll stand up here and say that I'm an expert on rules. I'm definitely not, and I'm sure that your standing committee is probably going through the same thing. It is about stakeholder engagement and getting people along for the journey. So even when it comes to landing the plane at the end, they're aware of it. But most of the ideas came from stakeholders. Most of the solutions came from our stakeholders, our coaches, our players, as well. So this was a really important piece for us, that it wasn't just about our team. We started to test the waters towards the end of the project with media. So we invited media into the AFL and showed them some of the data, showed them some of the vision that we actually compiled, and then they started to report on it. So we actually got a good feel of where people and fans and media were at with different decisions. And the goal square one that I sort of showed earlier was the one that was creating the most noise. So we were asked to go away and come up with a different solution for that, because basically we got that feedback from our fans and the industry that it's something that they didn't want. So we actually listened to them and adjusted to that once we started to test the waters. And then at the end of the thing was about landing the plane. So landing the 9 rules that we did make. And I can tell you this period was probably, as much as the analysis and the consultation was important, this was just as important. And being able to communicate clearly to all your stakeholders, your fans, your players on what the rules are and why you've brought them in is one of the most important things. So we did a lot of work around landing this plane. And it got a little rocky towards the end, because people, when it comes to, as I said, change and rules, they want to back out. But at the end of the day, things that we did were for the betterment of our game at the end of the day. It wasn't just about the fact that we wanted to change some rules. Some of you probably don't watch our game. Most of you probably don't watch our game, to be frank. They're the 9 rule changes that we made. As an example, we made a rule where at the start of every bounce, so after a goal's kicked or at the start of every quarter, players will set up in traditional centre bounce positions. So we have 6 forwards, 6 defenders and 6 midfielders. And for that moment in time, the game just is more spread. So that might last an extra couple of seconds. And that just allows players, we believe, in some of the stuff that we saw, more time and space to be a bit more instinctive. So that was some of the stuff that came back for us. So biggest learning is that as we went on this stakeholder journey, it wasn't us that should be thinking about the health of our game, even though the AFL, any governing body, has that duty of care for it. But it's basically everyone's responsibility as coaches, as fitness coaches, as administrators, that you're all there to look after the athlete. Everyone gets. But there's also a piece on how the game is played and what you're doing to leave it in a better state than what it was. That was the biggest learning. Probe the game. Any complex game or environment, you need to probe and test. Don't think there's experts out there. Coaches aren't all experts. Players aren't all experts. Administrators aren't all experts. But collaboratively, we can actually probe and work our best solution. Over-communicate. Let people into the building. Let them in to see what you're actually doing. Was a massive learning for us. Make sure that clubs understand that the reasoning behind this and players understand it. And the last thing was, I talked about it earlier, about collaboration. It's not about the league changing rules, it's about the industry collaborating together. So the health of the game, I'll just leave you with one question is, what are you doing about the health of your game? Is a question. And if you look at instinctive players, what are you doing to allow players to play with freedom, to problem solve, to be themselves? I think it was one of the speakers earlier talked about well-being. I can't think of his name on the top of my head. He talked about coaches creating a new game plan. So what kind of game plan are you creating? Are you just copying the leader as a coach? Are you just copying the team that's above you on the ladder? Or actually you just trying stuff and failing and working through that as well? Are you creating your own game plan? What are you standing for? And the last thing is, what are you doing to actually advance the game for our fans? So there's this balance for coaches of winning versus creating an entertainment spectacle, and it's a really fine balance. But we just can't forget that our fans are the lifeblood, and volunteers in your organisation are the lifeblood of sport. We just can't forget them as stakeholders. That's all I've got. It was a pretty short version of what the journey was from a rule change perspective. We've got an interesting 12 months ahead of us at the AFL when it comes to analysing the stuff we've done and also considering going forward and where we go to next. So thanks very much for your time.